Welcome back to day 3 of Photoshop in 7 days. This is Morgan Mead Makes. Hey, you've made it halfway. This is great. Today we're going to be looking at color correction of photos. So let's jump right in. Okay, here I have a picture of a downed tree that I took from one of my evening walks. I thought it was kind of ironic and funny, or just kind of weird. So I snapped a photo of it, and I thought we would use that today for our color correction tutorial. So we talked last time about using adjustment layers as a non-destructive way to hue shift something. If we use adjustment layers when we're editing, and we save the file and we come back to it the very next day and we look at it and we think all of the work that we just did is crap, and maybe our eyes were fatigued and the color just looks off or whatever, using adjustment layers means that we can always change it later. If we were to just go up to the image adjustments and use the levels, curves, exposure, vibrance, hue and saturation, any of these tools right here, these are totally destructive. Meaning, if I change the hue and saturation, hit OK, there is no way for me to save this, open it up later, and get it back exactly the way it used to be. So I'm going to undo that. The safest way to do this is with these adjustment layers down here in the layer panel. So let's take a look at levels first. Actually, let's back up. Let's look at brightness and contrast first. You guys might be familiar with brightness and contrast already. It's simple. You change the brightness up or down, and you change the contrast up or down. It's very simple color correction, but it's very linear too. You're adjusting the shadows, the highlights, the midtones all at once. There's no fine-tuning of anything. It's make the image brighter, make the image darker. That's it. If we go here and we go to levels, now suddenly we have more control over the image. Don't worry if this looks scary or foreign to you. I will explain. You've got 3 little arrows on the bottom. These indicate the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights of your image. And by default, shadows are all the way down, midtones are right smack in the middle, and highlights are all the way up. If I was to just take this midtones slider right here and just move it to the left or the right, I'm adjusting the tonal mapping of the whole image. I can make it darker by bringing my input value of the midtones all the way up, meaning if the input is bright and the output is still midtone, you're actually bringing that brightness all the way down to the middle. So you're essentially darkening the image. So I'm going to leave that right in the middle. I can also adjust the outputs right below that. So meaning my blacks that are all the way black right here, I can adjust this and say that anything that's all the way black is only ever going to get to like a medium darkness right here. Same thing with the highlights. Anything that's pure white, now I can say, don't output it as pure white, output it as mid-tone gray. So now nothing is going to be output as white. It's all going to be kind of muddled. If I move both of these to the middle, you'll get something that looks very super ugly, and if I condense them into one point in the middle, it will be that mid-tone gray color because nothing else gets output. So those are what the output values look like. Oh, by the way, we can reverse these too and make the image a negative. Okay, let's put the outputs back to where they need to go, and let's just take a look at the shadows. So I'm going to zoom in where probably the darkest areas are, and I'm going to look at this and I'm going to think, should these be darker? If so, I'm going to bring this input value up a little. Now I am going to lose information, meaning the color information is going to be clipped, anything under that point. So this part of the curve right here, the left side of the curve, that information is going to be gone. It's going to be solid black from this arrow up. So I will lose information, but maybe that's the way I want to color correct it. So I can darken up the shadows by bringing in the input, and I can brighten up the highlights by bringing in the highlight right there. I usually look at this histogram right here and look for kind of a point like this where it drops off a bit, and probably anything above that is going to be information that maybe I didn't need anyway. So I'm going to park my highlights right about there. And same thing with the shadows. I'm going to look for the first little bump that I see, which I guess is like right here. And I'm going to bring my shadow input right there. I can toggle it on and off to see the difference. And you can already see the original has kind of almost like a grayish overlay to it. But adding this filter sharpened things up quite a bit. Okay, so I'm going to leave that right there. I could also adjust specific color channels, the red, green, and the blue, but I'm not going to mess with that right now. Okay, once we got our levels the way we want it, I'm going to go down here and look at color balance. Now, we did hue and saturation in the last episode yesterday, so color balance is a little bit different. This color balance is not like hue and saturation at all. Instead of taking the input color range and just shifting it, what we're actually doing is fine-tuning a balance in between two opposite colors. So take, for instance, the red and cyan colors right here. If I want to just balance this to the red, you can see I'm not really affecting the yellow and the blue at all, and I'm not really affecting the green and magenta balance. I'm just either adding kind of a red tint to the whole image or a bluish tint to the whole image. Now, I kind of like this reddish tint for some reason on this forest shot here. So I'm going to leave this maybe not quite as high up as I had it, but I am going to leave it red tinted. Now, the magenta and green, I almost never mess with that too much because it gets real weird looking real fast. It gets really purpley over here, and it gets like just really green right there. So if I ever adjust it, it's usually just like maybe plus or minus 3 at the most. But I often go red first and then down to the blue and yellow. So let's take a look at the blue and yellow. If I add too much yellow, it starts looking pretty ugly, but you can balance out the red by hitting it with just a little blue, and it usually beefs up the shadows a little bit when you do that. So I'm going to leave it maybe not quite that much because it looks a little purpley in the middle. Right there is pretty good. Now, if you look at the top of this panel, you'll see it says midtones. I've only been adjusting the midtones so far. I can also adjust shadows and highlights. They start you off with midtones because it's kind of the best place to start with this, but let's take a look at the shadows. If I go in here to some of the darker parts of the image, they all look a little bit red to me, and that could complement the midtones, or I could go opposite them. So let's just take a look. Let's wiggle the sliders a little bit. So if I go to the left, go a little more cyan, then I start getting a more natural color. If I start going more red, it's almost like old, 1980s level, snapshot Polaroids, which I think is actually kind of cool for this. So I'm going to leave it like that, and maybe just a skosh of blue, not too much, just a little smidgen. Okay, highlights. Let's check out highlights. If I look at the sign to me looks like it has some purple in it. So I'm going to add a little yellow to balance that out. And maybe take out some of the red just a little bit. Oh, that added some red. Maybe I do. Think about right there. highlights are another thing. I don't always mess with highlights too much. These tend to be lower amounts. Let's turn this on and off and see what we did. Okay, so it went from really green and yellow-ish to kind of red with some magenta in the background there. I think it's pretty cool. So that's color balance. And again, if we trade up these, if we switch these spots, we do get a slightly different result. So I find it best to color correct first with levels or curves, and then start working on color. So curves. Curves, you ask. What are curves? Well, let's turn off our levels because we don't need levels and curves. That's crazy. So I'm going to turn off all my filters, and I'm going to go back to my background layer so that the next layer I create is right above it. And I'm going to go to curves, right there under levels. And again, they have these groups, so it's like kind of the brightness values right here, and then the color values underneath that, and then some crazy stuff down below that. So let's look at curves. Right off the bat, you see the same histogram that we saw with levels. We've got that big hill with the little ski slope and the little bump at the end. That's the little tree you hit after you're done skiing. That's why I don't ski. So instead of having three little arrows at the bottom, though, we have this line that goes from shadows to highlights all the way up. What does this mean? Well, we can click to add points, and then we can click and drag to adjust that point. So this point right here does nothing for us because it's right smack in the middle, right where it used to be, and I can click and drag it off like that to get rid of it if I want. But that'll leave the image untouched if I just put a point in the middle. But if I want to kind of brighten it up from the midtones, I can just bring that point up a little bit. And if I want to darken it, I can bring it down just a little bit. Now you'll see right off the bat that it is darkening the darker areas quite a bit more than the levels did. The reason is this is non-linear. So if you look at the slope right here from the shadow point to the midtone point, it stays low for longer and then swoops up. So that means it stays dark for more of the image. And for the lighter half of the image, from the midtones up to the highlights, we're still kind of staying dark, and then speeding up toward the highlights. So in other words, the midtones are going to be a little bit darker, and then it's going to get back on track real quick for the highlights. So the highlights are still pretty bright. And I can get there quicker too by grabbing this point and moving it like this. So the highlights and the midtones are all of a sudden like really super bright. But notice that affects the tail end too. The shadows just got a whole lot darker as well because it's trying to keep a nice curve between them. And it's doing a poor job, if I do say so myself. Okay, so let's just darken this up just a hair by bringing this down just a hair. I can add another point right here and bring these down, but I want to be careful not to break that curve too much. So I'm watching my slope right here, and what I don't want is to do something like this, where it's flat, curves up, curves down. You know, we're kind of making odd shapes there. We want a nice, smooth, tangential curve like this. And I could bring this one up and just kind of S-curve it a little bit like that. Yeah, something like that. So now I have a nice dark forest, but I can brighten up the brighter spots a little bit by doing that. And you get kind of a, you get a more natural curve out of this. It's not linear, so you're not affecting the whole image with one slider. You get to really fine-tune what parts of the image you want to bring up and down. So curves are really powerful, a little bit tricky though. Let's reset this. So I'm just going to drag these points off. And I'm going to show you one more thing with curves. this little finger with the arrows up and down, this is another little magic Photoshop function that doesn't make any sense in real life. It's like, how the heck does this even work? I can pick an area that I want to, say, darken up. Like this little spot right here looks a little gray washed to me. So I'm going to click and I'm going to drag down. And what it's going to do is going to take that input spot, which was right there on the histogram, and it's just going to darken that up without affecting the rest of the image linearly. So you can see it made a nice little slope from there. Now I can take the sign and I can say, you know what, I want the sign to be brighter. So I'm going to bring that up just maybe that much. And I essentially just got what I made a second ago, where it made that nice little S curve up. A couple other things you could do is, here, let me get rid of these points again, just drag those off. And I can choose my darkest place right here. So whatever I want to be black, I'm going to take this black eyedropper and I'm going to click. Now that's black. I'm going to take whatever I want to be white, which would be, I don't know, this bright part on the sign right here. Click, and now that's white. And I'm going to take my mid-tone and I'm going to try to find a mid-tone gray. It's best not to pick a color for this. So I'm going to pick maybe right there. And you'll see what that did was it not only adjusted the brightness, but it split out the red, green, and blue channels and adjusted those as well. So it did a little bit of color correction on top of our brightness. And the last thing is you can actually draw your own line right here, which I would not recommend because look at that thing. The last thing I want to show you is tinting the whole image. So let's go back down here to our adjustment layers and let's look for solid color right there at the top. And I want to tint this maybe orange. Orange and blue give really cool results if you want to try those out. Let's just move this all the way up to the top. And obviously this does us no good as it is because it's just simply a fill layer. By the way, comes with a layer mask, so you can, cut some things out of it if you want to with the brush, like we talked about in the last episode. But if I just want to tint the whole image, what I can do is go up here to where it says normal and hit the drop down. This is the blending mode. So what I like to do is click, and now it's highlighted, and I can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to just scroll through the different blending modes to find one that does the trick. So you can see how they all blend a little bit differently. And this is a very unscientific way of finding the blending mode that works for you. But it's also a great way of just, experimenting and seeing what it does. Now, if I go to the color blending mode, it's going to take that color and apply it to the luminance values of the underlying layers. So I can take my opacity now and just kind of bring that back a bit. And what it's going to do is just apply a little bit of a tint to that image. So I can turn it on and off and show you. You can get some really cool old school effects that way too. You can do a similar thing with adding a black solid layer. And then I'm going to go to the layer mask of it real quick. And I'm going to get my brush and I'm going to make it nice and big. And I'm going to make sure that the hardness is all the way down. And I'm just going to kind of draw in the middle like this. And this is a really nice way of getting a vignette on your image. So I don't want the edges like that to be so harsh and black down here. So I can change the opacity to something, I don't know, around 80, 75 or 80, something like that. And just kind of darken up the edges, give it a nice old school vignette, and then, with 2 color fill layers, all of a sudden I have like an old looking photo. It looks really cool. It's like those old Western photos that you get at the fairgrounds once a year. That's kind of how they do that effect. That's it for day 3, color correction. I would like you to go practice now for about 45 minutes or so. Get used to layers and layer masking and all these adjustment layers, and just practice color correcting different images. You know, find some photos online that you think are good or bad or whatever, and see what you can do with blending modes and adjustment layers. And then, you know, after 45 minutes, stop. Make yourself stop, go to bed, come back tomorrow, and I'll see you on day 4.